Hey guys, tonight we're going to be talking about a period of Chinese history that, on the surface, seems like a golden age. The Song Dynasty. From 960 to 1279 was a time of immense technological and cultural advancement. It was a time of beautiful poetry, stunning landscape paintings, and revolutionary inventions like movable type printing and gunpowder. But if you look just a little bit closer, you'll see a darker, more complex story. The Song Dynasty was a civilization with a fatal flaw, a series of profoundly awful decisions that would ultimately lead to its demise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the heart of the Song Dynasty, in a bustling, vibrant city that is a marvel of the world. The streets are a cacophony of sound, the chatter of merchants, the braying of donkeys, the clatter of carts on the paved roads. The air is thick with the smell of spices and cooking food, a rich and intoxicating mix of aromas. You see people dressed in silk and brocade, their faces a picture of prosperity and contentment. This is a golden age, a time of peace and plenty, and you, as a visitor, feel a sense of awe, but there is a subtle undercurrent of tension, a quiet fear that lurks beneath the surface of this prosperity. And it's all due to the dynasty's first and most terrible decision, its founding philosophy of pacifism. You see, the Song Dynasty was founded by a general, Zhao Guangyin, who was deeply wary of the power of the military. He had, in a sense, been a part of a military coup that had put him on the throne, and he was terrified that the same thing would happen to him. His solution was a radical and dangerous one. He decided to systematically weaken the military and elevate the civilian bureaucracy. This was a profoundly awful decision. On the surface, it seemed like a good idea. He wanted to create a peaceful, stable society, a society that was ruled by scholars and thinkers, not by generals and warriors. He wanted to end the cycle of military coups and civil wars that had plagued China for centuries. But in doing so, he created a security nightmare. The Song military, which had once been a formidable fighting force, was systematically stripped of its power and its prestige. The best generals were retired, the military budget was slashed, and the army was filled with poorly trained and ill-equipped soldiers. The scholar officials, the men who ran the government, saw the military as a necessary evil at best, a source of political instability at worst. A fascinating and often overlooked detail is the way the Song emperors treated their generals. They would often summon them to the capital and give them a position in the civil service, a move that was meant to neutralize them politically, but also had the effect of leaving the army without its most experienced and capable leaders. This created a situation where the army was not just weak, but also leaderless. The emperor, in his fear of a military coup, had created a military that was utterly incapable of defending the country. This pacifist philosophy, this terrible decision, had a profound and lasting impact on the Song Dynasty. The dynasty, for all its cultural and technological brilliance, was surrounded by powerful and aggressive nomadic tribes, like the Khitan and the Urchins. These tribes, who were excellent horsemen and fierce warriors, saw the Song as a fat and easy target. The Song emperors, in their fear of the military, decided to deal with these threats not with force, but with a series of disastrous diplomatic decisions. They would pay the nomadic tribes a huge annual tribute, a form of blackmail that was both humiliating and economically draining. The Song, in their arrogance and their fear, believed that they could buy peace. But the truth is, they were simply paying their enemies to go away, and their enemies, seeing their weakness, only demanded more. This is a fun, though slightly dark, Joke from the period: why did the Song Dynasty keep losing wars? Because their soldiers were too busy writing poetry. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of their pacifist philosophy. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Song Dynasty's pacifism was a good or bad thing. Some historians argue that it was a necessary evil, a way to create a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity after centuries of civil war. They argue that the focus on the civilian bureaucracy led to a flowering of culture and technology that would not have been possible otherwise. Others argue that it was a profound and ultimately fatal mistake, a decision that left the country vulnerable to its enemies and ultimately led to its destruction. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden, and the dynasty's first and most terrible. Decision was to believe that the garden was safe, that the flowers would not be trampled. The tranquility of the Song Dynasty is an illusion, a beautiful facade built on a foundation of a terrible decision. You've already seen how the dynasty's pacifist philosophy created a weak military, but now you're about to witness the true consequence of that decision: the rise of the scholar official class and their complete and utter disdain for the very people who were meant to defend the country. This is a story of a class of men who, in their arrogance and their intellectual superiority, made a series of awful decisions that would ultimately lead to the military's total collapse and the country's downfall. You are a young man in the capital, and you are surrounded by the trappings of a golden age. You see men in beautiful silk robes, their faces serene and their conversations filled with poetry and philosophy. These are the scholar officials, the men who have passed the rigorous imperial examinations and now hold all the power in the government. They are the civil servants, the administrators, the judges, the governors. They are the very backbone of the Song Dynasty. They are also, you're about to find out, a source of immense weakness. The scholar officials believed that they were the intellectual and moral elite of the country. They saw the military as a necessary evil, a crude and uncultured class of men who were useful only for fighting. This was a common historical fact, and it was a profound and dangerous form of snobbery. The military was staffed by men who were often from the lower classes, and they were seen as uneducated, uncouth, and unworthy of respect. This class-based prejudice led to a series of awful decisions that would cripple the military and leave the country vulnerable. Your first taste of this prejudice comes in the form of a military parade. You watch as the soldiers march by, their uniforms drab and their movements clumsy. They are not the elite, well-trained soldiers of previous dynasties. They are a ragtag group of conscripts and ex-criminals, men who are often forced into service as a punishment for their crimes. The scholar officials who are watching the parade with you scoff and sneer at the soldiers, making witty and cruel jokes at their expense. This is a fascinating and often overlooked detail. The military was not just weak, it was also a source of shame and ridicule for the very people it was meant to protect, the scholar officials. In their disdain for the military, made a series of terrible decisions that would deliberately weaken the army. They would often choose military leaders not for their skill or their experience, but for their political connections. The idea was to keep the military loyal to the court, but the consequence was that the army was led by men who were often incompetent and corrupt. The scholar officials, in their fear of a military coup, had created a military that was not just weak, but also incapable of being led. This disdain for the military also led to a terrible decision to cut the military budget. The scholar officials, who were more interested in funding cultural projects and their own extravagant lifestyles, saw the military as a drain on the treasury. They would slash the military budget, leaving the soldiers with poorly made weapons, ill-fitting armor, and a lack of proper training. The army was a hungry and forgotten entity, and the soldiers, in their desperation, would often turn to crime and corruption. This is a profound and tragic detail. The very people who were meant to defend the country were forced to steal from it just to survive. the academic debate still rages as to whether the scholar officials were truly a force for good or evil. Some historians argue that their focus on the civilian bureaucracy and their intellectual pursuits led to a golden age of culture and technology. They argue that the Song Dynasty was a period of peace and prosperity that was a direct result of their pacifist philosophy. Others argue that the scholar officials were a class of arrogant, self-serving men who, in their disdain for the military, left the country open to its enemies. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the scholar officials, in their blindness, were the ones who left the gate unlocked. The Song Dynasty glitters like a polished jewel, a civilization of unparalleled artistic and intellectual achievement. You've seen the scholar officials, the men who, in their intellectual pursuits, were a part of a terrible decision to neglect the military. But now, you're about to discover the human cost of this golden age, the dark underbelly of a society that was both a marvel of progress and a crucible of immense human suffering. This is the story of the technological and cultural revolution, and the awful decisions that led to profound social inequality and poverty. You are walking through the streets of Kaifeng, the capital city, a metropolis of 1 million people. The city is a masterpiece of urban planning and engineering. You see bustling markets filled with goods from all over the known world, spices from the south, silks from the east, and jade from the west. You see beautiful gardens, serene temples, and towering pagodas that scrape the sky. This is a city that, by all accounts, should be a paradise. But you also see the other side of the coin. You see slums, crowded and unsanitary places where the poor live in squalor. You see people, their faces gaunt and their clothes ragged, begging for scraps of food. You see children, their bellies swollen with malnutrition, their eyes wide with hunger. This is a profound and tragic detail that is often left out of the history books the Song Dynasty. For all its wealth, was a society with a vast and growing gap between the rich and the poor. The Golden Age was golden only for a select few. The technology that was meant to benefit everyone was, in reality, a source of immense human suffering. Take, for example, the invention of movable type printing. This was a revolutionary invention, one that would change the course of human history. It allowed for the mass production of books, a process that would have a profound impact on literacy and education. But the scholar officials, in a terrible decision, used this technology not to educate the masses, but to reinforce their own power. They used it to print the classics and the government documents, the very texts that were required to pass the imperial examinations. The poor, who could not afford the books or the education, were left behind. This created a new class of men, the educated elite, who held all the power, and a vast underclass of uneducated and powerless people. The progress in agriculture was equally double-edged. The Song Dynasty saw a massive increase in agricultural productivity. With new strains of rice and new farming techniques, this was a common historical fact, and it was a source of great wealth for the country. But the wealth was not distributed evenly. The land was owned by a small, powerful class of landowners and scholar officials, and the farmers, who worked the land, were often tenants or sharecroppers. Living in a state of perpetual poverty, they were exploited, and their labor was used to create a wealth that they would never see. The Golden Age was built on the backs of a rural poor, who were living in a state of quiet desperation. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Song Dynasty's technological and cultural progress was worth the human cost. Some historians argue that the progress was a necessary step on the road to a more modern society, and that the inequality was simply a part of that process. Others argue that the inequality was a profound and ultimately fatal flaw, a decision that created a society that was fundamentally unstable and unjust. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, And it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the Golden Age, for all its splendor, was a golden age only for a few, and a time of immense suffering for many. The glittering beauty of the Song Dynasty's cultural and technological golden age is now stained with the grim reality of poverty and inequality. You've seen how the grand ideals of the scholar officials created a society that was both brilliant and deeply unjust. But now, you're about to witness one of the most horrifying and awful decisions of this era. A practice that was a source of immense beauty and immense human suffering, foot-binding. You are in a wealthy home, a place of elegance and refinement. You see women dressed in beautiful silks, their hair in intricate coiffures, their faces painted with a delicate precision, but you also see something else. Something that is both beautiful and profoundly disturbing. You see their feet. They are tiny, a mere 4 inches long, and they are encased in a delicate silk shoes that are a work of art. These are lotus feet, the ultimate symbol of beauty and status in the Song Dynasty. But you, as an observer, know the awful truth behind this beauty. You know the pain, the suffering, and the profound physical and psychological damage that was inflicted on these women to achieve this ideal. The practice of foot binding began in the 10th century, and it was a terrible decision, a decision that was born of a misogynistic ideal of female beauty and a desire to control women. A common historical fact is that the practice started with court dancers and spread to the rest of the upper classes, and it was seen as a symbol of wealth and status. A woman with bound feet could not work, could not walk long distances, and was therefore a clear sign that her family was wealthy enough to not need her labor. The process itself was an act of brutal, deliberate cruelty. It began when a girl was between the ages of 4 and 9. Her feet would be soaked in warm water and herbs, and her toes would be broken and folded beneath the sole of her foot. They would be bound tightly with long strips of linen, a process that was repeated every few days. The pain would be immense, a constant, throbbing agony that would last for years. A fascinating and little-known detail is that the practice was so painful that many girls would have to be drugged with opium to get through it. The bones of their feet would be permanently deformed, the arch of their foot broken, and their toes would be a mangled, deformed mess. The consequences of foot binding were both physical and psychological. The women, in their desire to achieve this ideal of beauty, were often crippled for life. They could not walk, they could not run, and they were a prisoner in their own homes. Their lives were confined to a small, domestic sphere, a world of needlework, poetry, and idle gossip. They were a symbol of their family's wealth, but they were also a symbol of their own profound and painful powerlessness. The academic debate still rages as to whether foot binding was a form of self-expression or a form of social control. Some historians argue that the women who had bound feet saw it as a source of pride, a symbol of their elite status. Others argue that it was a profound act of oppression, a way for men to literally control a woman's ability to move through the world. The truth is, the practice of foot binding was a complex mix of both. It was a choice that was, in many ways, not a choice at all. It was a decision that was dictated by a social and cultural ideal that was both beautiful and profoundly cruel. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the men of the Song Dynasty love foot binding so much? Because it was the only way they could get their wives to stay home. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the practice as a form of control. You, as an observer, feel a sense of profound sadness and disgust. You see a beautiful woman, a woman of grace and intelligence, who has been crippled for life to satisfy a cultural ideal. You see a practice that was, in a sense, a beautiful and brutal lie, the lotus feet. For all their beauty, were a symbol of a society that was so obsessed with an abstract ideal of beauty that it was willing to inflict immense pain and suffering on its own women. This is one of the most awful truths about the Song Dynasty. A dark underbelly of a golden age that is as shocking as it is tragic. The Song Dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty. And the practice of foot binding is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. You've seen the brutal truth behind the beautiful facade of the Song Dynasty. A society that was capable of immense cruelty in the name of cultural ideals. But now, you're about to witness an entirely different kind of disaster. One that was born not of a misogynistic ideal, but of a brilliant and profoundly misguided idea. This is the story of the invention of paper money, and the awful decisions that led to hyperinflation, economic collapse, and social unrest. You are in a bustling market, a place of immense wealth and trade, but there's a new element here, a new form of currency that is both a marvel and a source of profound fear. You see people exchanging small, thin pieces of paper, each one with a number and a beautiful, intricate design. This is paper money, or jiaozi, and it's a revolutionary invention. It's a fun, but often overlooked, historical detail that the Song Dynasty was the first civilization in the world to use paper money on a large scale. The idea was to make trade easier, to eliminate the need for heavy and cumbersome coins, and to create a more efficient and dynamic economy. But the beautiful and brilliant idea of paper money quickly became a source of immense chaos and suffering. Your first terrible decision, one that would have devastating consequences, was to print too much of it. The government, in a fit of economic hubris, began to print more and more paper money, using it to pay for its massive military and its extravagant court. The idea was to create a source of wealth out of nothing, but the reality was that they were devaluing the currency with every new note they printed. The more paper money there was in circulation, the less it was worth. You see the effects of this terrible decision in the marketplace? A merchant who once sold a bag of rice for a few coins is now demanding a huge stack of paper money for the same bag. The price of everything is skyrocketing, and the people, whose wages are not keeping up with the rising prices, are becoming poorer and poorer. The money in your pocket, a beautiful and intricate piece of paper, is now worth less than it was yesterday, and it will be worth even less tomorrow. This is hyperinflation, and it's a profound and terrifying way for a civilization to fall apart. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Song Dynasty's use of paper money was a good or bad idea. Some historians argue that the invention of paper money was a necessary step on the road to a more modern economy, and that the hyperinflation was simply a series of growing pains. Others argue that the hyperinflation was a profound and ultimately fatal flaw, a decision that created a society that was fundamentally unstable and unjust. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the paper money, for all its beauty and its promise, was a beautiful and fragile lie that was, in the end, used to destroy it. The effects of this hyperinflation were not just economic, they were also social and political. The poor, who had nothing but their paper money, were now starving. The rich, who had land and gold, were becoming richer. The gap between the rich and the poor, which was already a problem, was now becoming a chasm. The people, in their desperation, began to riot, to protest, and to demand a change. The government, in a terrible decision, responded not with economic reform, but with a series of brutal crackdowns. The paper money, which was meant to be a symbol of wealth and progress, was now a symbol of oppression and injustice. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the Song Emperor love paper money so much? because it was the only way he could afford all his jade. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the imperial court's extravagance and its disregard for the common people. You, as a witness, feel a sense of profound sadness and anger. You see a brilliant idea, a revolutionary invention that was corrupted and destroyed by a series of terrible and foolish decisions. The paper money, for all its promise, was a symbol of a civilization that was so obsessed with an abstract idea of wealth that it was willing to destroy its own people to achieve it. The Song Dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, and the story of its paper money is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The paper money, a symbol of progress, was, in the end, a symbol of a civilization that was devouring itself. The beautiful but brittle promise of paper money has shattered into 1,000 worthless pieces. Leaving the Song Dynasty's economy in shambles, you've witnessed the awful decisions that led to this disaster. Decisions born of a brilliant idea gone terribly wrong. But now, you're about to discover an entirely new layer of rot at the heart of this seemingly golden age. This is the story of the extravagant lifestyle of the imperial court, and the awful decisions to prioritize luxury and personal pleasure over the security and well-being of the state. You are inside the imperial palace, a place of immense beauty and obscene wealth. The air is thick with the scent of sandalwood and expensive perfumes. You see eunuchs, dressed in beautiful silk robes, scurrying about. Their faces a mask of professional serenity. You see concubines, their faces painted and their hair in intricate styles, their every movement a work of art. The palace is a world unto itself, a gilded cage where the emperor and his court live a life of unimaginable luxury, a life that is completely detached from the reality of the people he rules. The emperor, in a terrible and profound decision, has allowed himself to become a prisoner of his own pleasure. He is more interested in art, in poetry, in music, and in the company of his concubines than he is in the affairs of the state. He is a patron of the arts, a connoisseur of jade and porcelain, and a lover of beautiful gardens. He is, in a word, a dilettante. This is a common historical fact, and it was a source of profound weakness for the Song Dynasty. The emperor, who was meant to be the ultimate protector of the state, was a man who had lost interest in the very thing he was meant to protect. The cost of this imperial indulgence was staggering. The emperor, in a series of awful decisions, would spend a fortune on his personal pleasures. He would commission beautiful works of art. He would build lavish new palaces and gardens. And he would import expensive and exotic goods from all over the world. The money for these projects came from the imperial treasury, a treasury that was already being drained by the bribes being paid to the northern tribes and the hyperinflation caused by the paper money. The country was, in a sense, being bled dry by its own ruler, a ruler who was more interested in his own pleasure than he was in the well-being of his people. A particularly fascinating and little-known detail is the emperor's obsession with a rare type of rock known as Tai Hu Shi, or lake rocks. These were large, porous, and unusually shaped rocks that were found in Lake Tai. The emperor, in a terrible decision, would commission vast expeditions to the lake to retrieve these rocks. The expeditions were incredibly expensive, and they would often cause immense disruption to the local populace. The people, in their desperation, would often have their homes and their fields destroyed to get a rock for the emperor's garden. It's a profound and tragic detail, a symbol of a ruler who was so detached from the reality of his people that he was willing to destroy their lives for a beautiful rock. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the emperor love beautiful rocks so much? Because they were the only things in the palace that didn't talk back. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the emperor's indifference and his profound detachment. The academic debate still rages as to whether the emperor's obsession with art and beauty was a good or bad thing. Some historians argue that his patronage of the arts led to a golden age of culture, an age that produced some of the most beautiful poetry, painting, and porcelain in human history. Others argue that his patronage was a profound and ultimately fatal flaw, a decision that left the country vulnerable to its enemies and ultimately led to its destruction. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the emperor, in his blindness and his indulgence, was the one who was watering the weeds. You, as a witness, feel a sense of profound sadness and disgust. You see a beautiful palace, a palace that is a symbol of a civilization at its peak. But you also see the dark truth behind that beauty. You see a ruler who, in his obsession with luxury and pleasure, was completely and utterly out of touch with his people. You see a country that was being bled dry by its own ruler. A ruler who was more interested in a rock than he was in the well-being of his people. The Song Dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty. And the story of its imperial indulgence is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The emperor, a man who was meant to be a symbol of a strong and stable state, was, in the end, a symbol of a state that was rotting from the inside out. The gilded cage of the imperial court, with its beautiful rocks and its distracted emperor, has left the Song Dynasty a fragile and vulnerable thing. You've seen the awful decisions that led to this internal decay, but now you're about to witness a new kind of foolishness, one that was born not of pacifism or greed, but of a profound and fatal arrogance. This is the story of the Song Dynasty's terrible decisions in forming and breaking alliances with northern powers. A series of diplomatic blunders that would ultimately lead to their downfall. You are a young official in the capital, and you are privy to the court's foreign policy. The air is thick with a sense of self-satisfaction, a belief that the Song Dynasty, with its superior culture and its advanced technology, is a beacon of civilization in a world of barbarians. The northern tribes, the Khitan and the Yurkins, are seen not as equals, but as a source of annoyance and a constant drain on the treasury. The court's terrible decision, one that would have devastating consequences, was to believe that they could outwit and outmaneuver these northern powers, to play them against each other, and to ultimately defeat them without having to fight a real war, the first and most significant. Of these blunders was the alliance on the sea with the Yurkin people, the Khitan. A powerful nomadic tribe, had been a constant thorn in the Song's side for decades. The Song had been paying them a huge annual tribute, a form of blackmail that was both humiliating and economically draining. The Yurshins, a new and aggressive tribe, had risen to power in the north, and they were also enemies of the Khitan, the Song. In a fit of diplomatic hubris, decided to form an alliance with the Yurchins. The idea was to attack the Khitan from both sides, to crush them, and to finally end the humiliation of the annual tribute. This was a common historical fact, and it was a brilliant idea on paper, but the reality was a disaster. Your first terrible decision was to underestimate the Yurgins. They were a powerful and aggressive fighting force, and they quickly defeated the Khitan, far more easily and completely than the Song had anticipated. The Song, who had been expecting a long and difficult war, were caught completely off guard, the Yurchins, having defeated their common enemy, now had their sights set on a new and easier target, the Song Dynasty. The academic debate still rages as to whether the alliance on the sea was a good or bad idea. Some historians argue that it was a bold and necessary move, a way to end the humiliation of the Khitan and to finally secure the northern border. Others argue that it was a profound and ultimately fatal mistake, a decision that created a new and more powerful enemy, and that it was a decision that was born of a profound ignorance of the true nature of the northern tribes. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the Song, in their blindness, were the ones who invited a much bigger wolf to the dinner party. A second and equally terrible decision was the way the Song treated their new allies. The Jurchens, having defeated the Khitan, were expecting to be rewarded for their help. But the Song, in their arrogance, refused to honor their promises. They saw the Jurchens as uncultured barbarians, and they treated them with a profound sense of disrespect. This was a foolish and dangerous move. The Jurchens, who had just defeated a powerful enemy, were now a powerful and angry fighting force, and they were looking for a reason to go to war with the Song. The Song, in their blindness, had given them one. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the Song officials think they could outsmart the Jurchens? Because they thought they could win a war with a well-written poem. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of their diplomatic blunders. You, as a witness, feel a sense of dread. You see a civilization that is so convinced of its own superiority that it is completely blind to the reality of the world. You see a series of terrible decisions, born of arrogance and ignorance, that are leading the country to a profound and tragic end. The Song Dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, and the story of its foreign policy is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The alliances, which were meant to be a source of strength, were, in the end, a source of profound weakness. And the country, which was meant to be a beacon of civilization, was, in the end, a victim of its own arrogance. The storm is coming, and you are standing in the eye of it. The storm you felt brewing has finally arrived, and it is more terrible than you could have ever imagined. The northern tribes, whom the Song Dynasty had foolishly tried to play against each other, are now a single unified and terrifying force. This is the story of the Mongol onslaught, and the final, awful decisions made by the Song emperors in the face of an enemy that was, in every way, a force of nature. This is a story of a beautiful and fragile civilization that was about to be utterly and brutally annihilated. You are in the capital, now a different one, the city of Lin'an, a place of immense beauty and refinement. But the beauty is a lie, a thin veneer of civility over a profound and terrifying fear. The news from the north is a constant stream of horrors. You hear stories of a new enemy, the Mongols, a nomadic tribe of fierce warriors and brilliant horsemen. They are led by a man named Genghis Khan, and they are sweeping across the continent with a speed and a ferocity that is unprecedented. The Song, with their weak military and their arrogant scholar officials, are utterly unprepared for this new enemy, the court's first terrible decision, one that would have devastating consequences, was to underestimate the Mongols. The scholar officials, in their profound ignorance, saw the Mongols as just another barbarian tribe, a people who could be bribed with a huge annual tribute and then sent on their way. They believed that the Great Wall and the natural defenses of the rivers and mountains would be enough to hold them off. This was a foolish and fatal miscalculation. The Mongols were not just a tribe, they were an army, a vast and disciplined fighting force that was led by some of the most brilliant military minds in human history. They were not interested in a bribe. They were interested in conquest. The academic debate still rages as to why the Song Dynasty was so blind to the Mongol threat. Some historians argue that their long history of dealing with northern tribes had created a sense of complacency, a belief that all barbarians could be bought off. Others argue that the scholar officials, in their profound disdain for the military, were simply unwilling to believe that a group of uncultured nomads could pose a threat to their civilization. The truth is, the Song Dynasty was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the Song, in their blindness, were the ones who left the door unlocked for the biggest and most brutal wolf of them all. The Mongol invasion itself was a series of horrifying and brutal battles. The Song military, with its poorly trained soldiers and its incompetent leaders, was no match for the Mongol hordes. The cities of the Song, which were so beautiful and so prosperous, were systematically besieged and destroyed. The people, who had been living in a golden age of art and culture, were now living in a world of fire and blood. You hear stories of entire cities being put to the sword, of the rivers running red with the blood of the dead, of the people being treated with a level of cruelty that was unprecedented in Chinese history. A particularly tragic and little-known detail is the use of gunpowder by the Song military. The Song, who had invented gunpowder, used it to create bombs and rockets to defend their cities, but the weapons were often poorly made and unreliable, and they were no match for the sheer numbers and the military genius of the Mongols. The gunpowder, a symbol of a golden age of technological advancement, was, in the end, a symbol of a civilization that was too weak and too unprepared to use its own inventions to save itself. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the Song Emperor think he could defeat the Mongols? Because he had a new poem about peace. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the emperor's profound detachment and his complete inability to understand the true nature of the threat. You, as a witness, feel a sense of profound sadness and terror. You see a civilization that, in its arrogance and its complacency, had created the very conditions for its own destruction. The Song Dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, and the story of its final days is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The Mongols, a force of nature, were, in the end, a force that was made all the more powerful by the Song's own weakness and their own terrible decisions. The end is coming, and it is a brutal and horrifying end. The Mongol horde has swept through the north, leaving a trail of destruction and a legacy of terror. The northern Song Dynasty, that beautiful and fragile civilization you knew, has been utterly annihilated. But the story doesn't end there. A remnant of the imperial court, a small and desperate group of officials, managed to escape south and establish a new dynasty. The Southern Song. This is the story of this final, tragic era, and the terrible decisions of a court that was more interested in art and poetry than it was in the survival of its own people. You are in the new capital, Hangzhou, a city of breathtaking beauty. It is a city of canals and bridges, of beautiful gardens and stunning pagodas. It is a city of immense wealth and prosperity, a city that, by all accounts, should be a new golden age. But the beauty is a lie, a thin veneer of civility over a profound and terrifying fear. The court, having learned nothing from the fall of the North, has become even more obsessed with its own pleasure and its own self-importance. The scholar officials, in a terrible decision, have retreated from the reality of the world and have become even more obsessed with art, with poetry, and with philosophy. They are a court of poets and painters, and they are a court that is completely unprepared for the reality of a world filled with enemies. The most egregious and awful decision of this period was the court's refusal to acknowledge the true nature of their situation. The Southern Song was a state in exile, a small and fragile entity that was surrounded by powerful and aggressive enemies. To the north were the Yurkhans, the very people who had destroyed the Northern Song. To the west were the Mongols, a force that was growing in power and ferocity with every passing year. The court, in a profound act of self-delusion, believed that they could simply ignore these enemies, that they could buy them off with a huge annual tribute, and that they could live in peace and prosperity in their beautiful city. This was a foolish and fatal miscalculation. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Southern Song's obsession with art and culture was a good or bad thing. Some historians argue that their patronage of the arts led to a final, brilliant flowering of Chinese culture, a last gasp of a beautiful and brilliant civilization. Others argue that their obsession with art was a profound and ultimately fatal flaw, a decision that left the country vulnerable to its enemies and ultimately led to its destruction. The truth is, the Southern Song was a beautiful and fragile flower, and it was a flower that was growing in a very dangerous garden. And the court, in its blindness and its indulgence, was the one who was watering the weeds. A fascinating and little-known detail is the obsession of the Southern Song court with the game of Go. It was a game of strategy, of subtle moves and profound complexity. The court, in its obsession with Go, saw the game as a metaphor for their foreign policy. They believed that they could outwit and outmaneuver their enemies on the board, and that they could, in a sense, win a war without ever having to fight one. This was a profoundly foolish and dangerous belief. The game of Go is not a substitute for a strong military, and the court, in its blindness, was playing a game that it had already lost. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the Southern Song court love poetry so much? Because it was the only way they could express their feelings about losing to the Mongols. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the court's profound detachment and its complete inability to understand the true nature of the threat. You, as a witness, feel a sense of profound sadness and disgust. You see a civilization that is in its final tragic chapter. A civilization that is so obsessed with its own beauty and its own self-importance that it is completely blind to the reality of the world. You see a series of terrible decisions, born of arrogance and ignorance, that are leading the country to a profound and tragic end. The Southern Song was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, and the story of its final days is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The court, which was meant to be a symbol of a strong and stable state, was, in the end, a symbol of a state that was rotting from the inside out. The storm is coming, and this time, there is no one left to run. The final act of the Song Dynasty is a tragedy of epic proportions. You've witnessed the awful decisions that led to its slow decay, from its founding philosophy to its final. Desperate moments. The Mongols, a force of nature, are now at the gates of the Southern Song. The beautiful city of Hangzhou, a city of poets and painters, is about to fall. This is the story of the aftermath, the lasting, awful legacy of a failed state, and the seeds it sowed for a new and much more brutal dynasty. The fall of the Southern Song was a swift and brutal affair. The court, with its weak military and its detached scholar officials, was no match for the Mongol hordes. The emperor, a young boy, was captured, and the dynasty, which had ruled for over 3 centuries, came to a brutal and humiliating end. The city of Hangzhou, a symbol of a golden age, was sacked, and the people, who had been living in a world of art and poetry, were now living in a world of fire and blood. This is a common historical fact, and it's a brutal end to a beautiful story. But the real tragedy of the Song Dynasty is not just its fall, it is the lasting, awful legacy it left behind. The Song, in their fear of the military and their elevation of the civilian bureaucracy, had created a political system that was fundamentally unstable. The scholar officials, in their arrogance and their snobbery, had created a class of men who were more interested in their own power and their own privilege than they were in the well-being of the state. This is a profound and tragic detail, and it would have a profound and lasting impact on the future of China. The Mongols, in their conquest of China, did not simply destroy the Song dynasty, they absorbed it. They adopted the Song's bureaucratic system. They used the Song's technology, and they learned from the Song's mistakes. But they also, in a terrible and profound decision, learned from the Song's weaknesses. They saw that a civilization that was so obsessed with its own internal affairs and its own intellectual pursuits was a civilization that was ripe for conquest. They saw that a civilization that had a weak military and a powerful, but ultimately useless. Bureaucracy was a civilization that was destined to fall. The Mongols, in their brutal and pragmatic way, learned from the Song's failures, and they used those failures to create a new and much more brutal dynasty. The Yuan dynasty. A fascinating and little-known detail is that the Mongols, in their conquest of China, did not just rely on their own military prowess, they also relied on a number of defectors from the Song military. Men who had been so demoralized and so disillusioned by the Song court that they were willing to betray their own country. These defectors, in their knowledge of the Song's military and its weaknesses, were a profound and terrible asset to the Mongol war machine. It's a powerful and tragic detail, a testament to the fact that the Song dynasty was a dynasty that was not just destroyed by an external enemy, but was also destroyed from within. This is a fun, though slightly dark, joke from the period. Why did the Mongols love the Song dynasty so much? Because it was the only dynasty that gave them a detailed map of all its weaknesses. It's a bit of levity in a very serious situation, but it also perfectly encapsulates the cynical view of the Song's legacy. The academic debate still rages as to whether the Song dynasty was a beautiful failure or a profound success. Some historians argue that the Song, in its embrace of pacifism and its focus on civilian rule, was a civilization that was ahead of its time. A civilization that was trying to create a world that was ruled by peace and not by war. Others argue that the Song, in its arrogance and its profound military weakness, was a civilization that was fundamentally flawed, a civilization that was destined to fall. The truth is, the Song dynasty was a complex and contradictory civilization, a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a civilization that was a profound and beautiful lie. You, as a witness, feel a sense of profound sadness and awe. You see a civilization that, in its arrogance and its complacency, had created the very conditions for its own destruction. The Song dynasty was a civilization that was capable of immense beauty and immense cruelty, and the story of its final days is a perfect encapsulation of that profound and disturbing contradiction. The Mongols, a force of nature, were, in the end, a force that was made all the more powerful by the Song's own weakness and their own terrible decisions. The end is a brutal and horrifying end, a final chapter in a story of a dynasty that, for all its beauty, was a dynasty that was built on a foundation of sand. The story of the Song dynasty is now complete. The beautiful and brutal truth of this golden age, with its poetry and its paper money, its foot-binding and its failed alliances, has been revealed. The sun sets on this ancient world, and the echoes of its long-forgotten battles, its whispered poems, and its terrible decisions begin to fade. You are no longer in the palace, no longer in the battlefield, but in the quiet, peaceful darkness of your own room, the weight of history, the sadness of a failed state, the knowledge of a brutal end. All of it begins to soften, to recede into a gentle, historical blur. Everything is slowing down. The complex story of the Song dynasty is now a single, peaceful thread, and you can let go of it. The history is done. The journey is over. There's nothing left to do but close your eyes and rest.